Hi everyone. Today I'll be discussing rebuttal speeches. So I'll begin by talking a little bit more in depth about the tips that I laid out, and then go discuss an example case that I'd quickly come up with. So let's begin with the first tip I had. A good rebuttal should try to provide at least one piece of evidence that negates a point that the opponent makes. So what I mean with this is that you need to kind of go punch for punch with every single one of the points that your opponent brings. Now that doesn't mean necessarily addressing every single thing they bring up, but at least for each of their contentions, go step by step and bring up one piece of evidence for a piece of evidence they have that somehow negates the argument that they're trying to make, so they can't bring up the fact that their argument still continues throughout the debate because you weren't able to address this. It's going to be extremely important that you don't just focus on one single point or one main argument that they bring up. Make sure you find a way to address almost everything that they have brought up. Now, we move on to the second point, which is to try to follow the format of claim, warrant, and impact. So a couple weeks ago, you guys saw a video about, claim, warrants, and impacts and how they apply to this first speech and how you can find them in a lot of these different speeches. Now, I'm going to show you how you can apply this to your rebuttal speech itself and how it actually improves the rebuttal speech a lot. The third point I have is to be well versed with the cards you have. They'll be crucial in making your rebuttal argument stronger. So this is really important because you need to be sure that you know what evidence you have and what you have in your arsenal to use against your opponent as a rebuttal speaker, because it'll be crucial that you're able to think on the fly. Now, just last week, you guys learned about impromptu speaking, and we can see that by knowing your arguments, you'll be able to come up with stuff on the spot that will allow you to be able to come up with examples that you can bring up in this impromptu rebuttal speech that you're having with the limited amount of time that you get to be able to share your information. So finally, I have the final point, which is using direct sources of information will help improve your argument. We're just saying that essentially you want to use evidence in a similar way how you tie in evidence in your first speech. You want to have examples from various sources with quotes that you can use throughout your speech and embed in them to try to help improve and bolster your point. It adds a lot of credibility to your points, and I'll kind of show you how that works. So let's move on to an example case I wrote quickly, which is resolved. High school should remain online for the 2020 to 2021 school year because of COVID-19. So let's quickly analyze a negative case or a negation case that I'd written for this. It's on the left side here. I'd kind of just written a quick outflow. So here is the negative or con case. First point, socioeconomic disadvantages alienate poor students from access to class materials. My second point was that cases of COVID-19 are heavily decreasing in the US. And final point is that it's harder for students to focus in an online class setting. So let's look at the first point, because this is the main point where I'd written all this evidence, and I'll kind of show on the opposite side how you can argue that with this first point. So the evidence I brought up, I used one source in this case just for this quick demonstration, which is from the NCES, or the National Center of Education Statistics, which they shared in a 2015 study that only 61% of children between the ages of 3 and 18 had internet access at home. Furthermore, 66% white students and 63% Asian students reported that they have internet at home, while only 53% of black students, 52% of Hispanic students, and 49% of Native Americans had reported that they have internet access at home. Now, this is extremely problematic, as the negation would argue, because not only are we seeing that there are over 39% of students that won't have internet access at home, which puts 39% of students at a significant disadvantage. Furthermore, we can see that there is also a lot of racial issues that come out of this because of the fact that we can see that white and Asian students are put at an advantage, while African American students or black students, Hispanic students, and Native Americans are put at a severe disadvantage in comparison to these students because they don't have as much access to internet at home. So now we look to the pro rebuttal, and I'll look at how I would phrase my claim as the pro speaker. So as the con case states, the socioeconomic disadvantages alienate poor students from access to class materials. I would argue as a pro rebuttal argument that students will not be alienated due to lack of technology. Pretty much what I did was I took the wording of the con case in their first point and kind of reworded it to directly negate that. And then I will show further with my evidence and my reasoning, or my warrants, my impact, as to why this applies. So I have evidence right here from the same source, the NCES, that states that 94% of children have access to a computer at home. Furthermore, 80% of 8th graders reported using a computer at home for schoolwork on a weekday. Furthermore, I looked to a Forbes article that was published just last week that claims that countless districts had rolled out devices and programs to eliminate this quote-unquote technology gap, like the Miami-Dade County Public School System that distributed more than 100,000 devices to students and ensures that students could get online. They found that this was very successful. So as you can see here, I have evidence from two sources. I have the NCES that shows drastically different numbers, and then also have this Forbes article that adds to this point. And so then I would go on to my impacts and my reasoning, which is claiming that this technology gap is solvable and we have months to find a solution. It's currently June and students are going to be coming back to school at earliest in August. A lot of these students will have a lot of these school districts will have opportunities to find solutions like the Miami-Dade County Public Schools did in March when they had a few weeks rather than a few months to solve this crisis and were able to give 100,000 devices to students, could ensure that they could mostly all get online. So you see, I could go with this claim, warrants, and impacts kind of setup to be able to share my point effectively. I provide this claim that directly negates the opposite side. I have evidence that disproves kind of step by step, punch by punch, every single aspect of their evidence that they brought up. And then finally, I had some reasoning or some impacts as to why this is so important and why the judge needs to take this into account rather than just listen to the arguments that the other side had made. Now I'm going to quickly go into the second point that I had in this case, which is that the con side or the negative side could argue that cases of COVID-19 are heavily decreasing in the US. But then my argument to this as an affirmative side could bring up simple evidence saying that the second wave of COVID-19 is imminent. If you're following the news right now, you know that there are a lot of pundits out there that are saying that COVID-19 isn't necessarily going to go away and there's a second wave that's rising, maybe not in Philadelphia or anywhere else in the Northeast, but in Florida, in Oklahoma, in New Mexico, in Colorado, in Utah, in California. There's a lot of different states that are going to face a second wave of COVID-19. That's an argument you can make. Now let's look at the third point, which is that it's harder for students to focus in an online class setting. Now, let's say I don't necessarily have a block or a card that shows that, it really is harder for students or easier for students to focus in an online setting class, or that it's at least not as problematic as the opponents are making out to be. What I can do is use a different tactic, which is showing that there should be focus on something else. In this case, I bring up in my third point that the focus should instead be on the health risk that's posed to students in the short term rather than focusing on the lack of focus that students might have in an online class setting. So while in this case, I would bring up examples like the CDC releasing an article just a couple days ago saying that students actually are at a risk, or children between the ages of 5 and 18 are at a decent risk, and younger people as a whole, if they have pre-existing health problems, like, for example, obesity. And we know that this country is facing an obesity epidemic where a lot of its underage, minors, these children, these youthful people are facing obesity at very high rates. Puts people with other health risks as well, any sort of health issues, at a severe risk just as much as older people. And that's something that the CDC had released that you could definitely bring up in your argument. Now you see, I'm taking the shift of students' focus in class and saying that that's minimal compared to the risks that really pose to students' health. And then I can also say that then there's risks to the families of these students and so on and so forth when you're going classes of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 students in this entire tiny high school, where students are forced to walk around and interact with one another in very close settings. Ultimately, we can see that we're able to take a lot of these arguments and shift in one way. So there was really a couple ways that I'd addressed arguments, which is like in the first point, where I directly negated it because I had the evidence, or in this case, second case, taking the argument and shifting it to a more important or more real threat, and kind of weighing the benefits and the negations of both and showing why the impact of your point is a lot more problematic or a lot more valid than the argument that they're making in their point. I hope this video helps, and I hope you guys do the activity. Good luck to the rest of you guys.